She was America's most glamorous cover girl, but the CIA didn't want her face. They wanted her mind. Through the brutal, drug-fueled torture of the MKULTRA program, the identity of Candy Jones was systematically erased. In the empty space they left behind, the intelligence machine birthed Arlene, a cold programmed assassin who used high fashion as a flawless disguise for deadly espionage. Trapped as a prisoner in her own body, Candy would wake up with battered ribs and forged passports, possessing zero memory of the covert missions she had just survived. This is the terrifying true story of the cover girl erased by the CIA and the birth of the Arlene assassin. Born in 1925 in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, she grew up in an environment defined by emotional distance. Her childhood was not a sanctuary of warmth. It was marked by a strict, demanding mother and the ambient trauma of physical abuse. In the field of modern psychology, it is well documented that children subjected to severe, inescapable distress often develop dissociative mechanisms. They learn to detach from their physical reality to survive the emotional pain. They build psychological compartments. Jessica learned very early how to hide her terror behind a blank, compliant smile. Decades later, the architects of the MKUltra program would not need to teach her how to split her mind. They merely had to exploit the fractures that her childhood had already laid down. By the early 1940s, Jessica Wilcox realized that her physical appearance was a currency she could trade for escape. She moved to New York City, a towering metropolis of ambition, and reinvented herself. She shed the name Jessica with all its associated childhood trauma and became Candy Jones. The transformation was absolute. Candy Jones was not just a model. She was an industrialized standard of American beauty. She was tall, statuesque, with cascading blonde hair and a smile that radiated wholesome, unthreatening perfection. During the Second World War, she became the ultimate pin-up girl. Her image was painted on the noses of American bomber planes and pinned up in the lockers of soldiers across the Pacific and European theaters. She was the visual representation of everything the American military was supposedly fighting to protect. But behind the flashbulbs, Candy was a fiercely intelligent pragmatist. She understood that the fashion industry, much like the intelligence community she would later encounter, viewed human beings as depreciating assets. A model's career is ruthlessly short. To survive, she transitioned from labor to management. In the late 1940s, she opened the Candy Jones Career Girls School in New York. She taught young women how to walk, how to speak, and how to project absolute confidence. She built a highly successful modeling agency, transforming herself into a powerful executive. She married Harry Conover, another titan of the modeling industry, establishing a high society power couple. To the outside world, Candy Jones had achieved the ultimate American dream. She possessed immense wealth, global connections, and a lifestyle that required her to travel constantly. She flew to Paris, Rome, Taipei, and Manila to organize fashion shows, scout talent, and consult for international brands. She moved through international airports with an entourage, designer luggage, and the unassailable privilege of celebrity. While Candy was building her fashion empire, a very different kind of empire was being constructed in the shadows of Washington, D.C. The conclusion of the Second World War had not brought peace. It had birthed the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent existential struggle. The battleground was not just territorial, it was psychological. In the early 1950s, the American intelligence community was gripped by a profound institutional paranoia. Reports emerging from the Korean War suggested that captured American soldiers had been subjected to advanced brainwashing techniques by Soviet and Chinese interrogators. The fear was that the communist bloc had discovered a way to rewrite the human mind, to turn loyal soldiers into sleeper agents. In response to this perceived threat, the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, under the direction of Allen Dulles, authorized a sprawling, deeply classified initiative. It was initially called Project Bluebird, then Artichoke, and finally MKULTRA. The sheer cruelty of MKUltra stemmed directly from the bureaucratic mindset of its architects. Sidney Gottlieb, the chief chemist who oversaw the program, did not view himself as a movie villain. He viewed himself as a patriot tasked with solving a complex engineering problem. The problem was the human mind. The CIA needed to know if an individual could be chemically and psychologically stripped of their free will, reprogrammed with a new identity, and deployed as a perfect, unbreakable operative. The intelligence community operates on a calculus that is terrifying in its rational detachment. When national survival is the stated objective, morality is immediately suspended. Human rights become an administrative inconvenience. The system is designed to identify resources and extract their utility. To the men of MKUltra, a human being was merely a piece of biological hardware waiting to be formatted. As the 1950s progressed, the CIA encountered a logistical hurdle. Traditional spies are inherently suspicious. A man carrying diplomatic pouches crossing borders frequently eventually draws the attention of counterintelligence. The CIA needed couriers who possessed the ultimate camouflage. They needed people who naturally belonged in first-class cabins, who possessed valid reasons to travel globally, and whose presence in foreign capitals would be entirely documented in the social pages rather than intelligence dossiers. They looked at the glittering world of international showbiz and high fashion, and they saw the perfect blind spot. Society is conditioned to look at a beautiful, wealthy woman and see only the surface. A customs officer does not interrogate a famous supermodel about state secrets. He asks for her autograph. A celebrity is shielded by the public's own superficiality. By the late 1950s, the trajectory of Candy Jones and the trajectory of the CIA's Psychological Warfare Division were rapidly converging. Candy's personal life was beginning to quietly collapse. Her marriage to Harry Conover was disintegrating under the weight of his financial mismanagement and erratic behavior. She was working relentlessly to keep her agency afloat, traveling across the globe while raising her children. The polished facade of the American icon was intact, but the structural integrity behind it was fracturing. She was suffering from severe physical and emotional depletion. Chronic insomnia plagued her. The anxiety of maintaining her public image while her private world burned left her desperate for relief. In the high-pressure ecosystem of New York, it was standard practice to seek out discreet medical professionals who could prescribe chemical solutions for exhaustion. Candy reached out for help. She wanted a doctor who could cure her sleeplessness, someone to temporarily quiet the relentless stress in her mind. What she did not know, and what she could not possibly have anticipated, was that the doctor recommended to her was deeply embedded within the intelligence community. He was a man who did not cure minds, he dismantled them. Candy Jones thought she was walking into a medical clinic for rest. In reality, she was walking directly onto the surgical table of the MKULTRA project. The trap was perfectly laid, and the extraction was about to begin. There is a fundamental sacred trust embedded in the relationship between a doctor and a patient. When we are exhausted, physically broken, or mentally unraveling, we enter a medical clinic believing it is a sanctuary. We bare our vulnerabilities to individuals in white coats under the absolute assumption that they are bound by the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. For Candy Jones, that trust was not merely broken, it was weaponized. In the late 1950s, desperate for relief from chronic insomnia, severe anxiety, and a failing marriage, Candy was referred to a physician. In the historical records and later testimonies, this man is often referred to by the pseudonym Dr. Gilbert Jensen. To the public, Jensen was a highly respected medical professional, a prominent figure in the Californian medical establishment with a lucrative private practice. He was articulate, authoritative, and possessed the exact bedside manner required to soothe an anxious, high-profile celebrity. But Dr. Jensen's private practice was merely a respectable front. He was a heavily funded contractor for the Central Intelligence Agency, deeply embedded in the MKULTRA program. He was not an independent rogue agent. He was a scientist acting with the full financial and operational backing of the United States government. When Candy sat in his consultation room, detailing her exhaustion and the immense pressures of running her fashion empire, Jensen did not see a patient in need of healing. He saw a biological asset. He saw a woman who possessed international mobility, high society clearance, and a deeply fractured psychological history. The CIA had been searching for the perfect unconscious courier. Jensen realized that the perfect courier had just walked into his office, actively asking for his help. The system's cruelty lies in its clinical patience. Jensen did not kidnap Candy Jones. He did not drag her into a black site. He manipulated her into volunteering for her own destruction under the guise of therapeutic treatment. The process began subtly. Jensen informed Candy that her severe fatigue could be treated with a course of specialized vitamin injections and progressive relaxation techniques. Candy, desperate to maintain her business and care for her children, agreed. The injections, however, were not vitamins. They were a potent, highly calculated cocktail of intravenous barbiturates, experimental sedatives, and synthetic hallucinogens, including LSD. Jensen's next phase relied on the terrifying science of mind control developed during the Cold War. The CIA had discovered that if you administer heavy doses of hallucinogens in a strictly controlled, terrifying environment, you can effectively dissolve a person's ego. The drugs strip away the subject's natural psychological defenses, inducing a state of absolute infantile vulnerability. Once Candy was chemically subdued and stripped of her conscious resistance, Jensen deployed the second phase of the weapon, aggressive, coercive hypnotherapy. Hypnosis in a therapeutic setting is used to access the subconscious to heal trauma. In the hands of MKUltra, it was a scalpel used to dissect the mind. Jensen bypassed the confident, polished persona of Candy Jones and dug directly into the dark, hidden recesses of Jessica Wilcox. He accessed the childhood trauma, the physical abuse, and the deep-seated fears that she had spent decades trying to bury. Jensen did not create the fracture in her psyche. He simply drove a wedge into the existing crack. He understood that when the human mind is subjected to unbearable trauma, it splinters. It creates walls to contain the pain. Through relentless drug-induced hypnotic suggestion, Jensen forced those walls to become permanent airtight compartments. He systematically dismantled her sense of self, isolating the weak, compliant parts of her personality from the strong, protective parts. And in the empty space he created, he began to build something new. He began to architect an entirely artificial personality, engineered specifically for the requirements of the Central Intelligence Agency. They named this synthetic entity Arlene. The creation of Arlene was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. The CIA did not need a glamorous fashion model to deliver explosives and classified documents. They needed a sociopath. Therefore, Arlene was programmed to be everything Candy Jones was not. Where Candy was warm, articulate, and eager to please, Arlene was icy, pragmatic, and utterly devoid of empathy. Arlene did not possess Candy's moral boundaries or her maternal instincts. To visually and psychologically separate the two identities, Jensen commanded Arlene to change her physical demeanor. When Arlene took control of the body, her vocal register dropped significantly. Her posture stiffened. She was instructed to wear a dark brunette wig, starkly contrasting Candy's famous blonde hair. Most importantly, Arlene was programmed with one overriding, unbreakable directive: absolute, unquestioning loyalty to Dr. Gilbert Jensen and the agency he represented. Arlene viewed Jensen as an omnipotent father figure. She would lie for him, she would steal for him, and, if required, she was prepared to kill for him. The programming process was brutal. During these sessions, Candy was often strapped to a medical chair. If the Candy personality attempted to resist the hypnotic commands, Jensen would administer mild electric shocks or inject painful chemicals to punish the host. If Arlene performed well, she was rewarded. It was a terrifying application of classical conditioning, reducing a highly successful businesswoman to the level of a laboratory animal. To ensure the security of the operation, Jensen installed sophisticated psychological triggers. He implanted post-hypnotic suggestions that would act as switches. A specific sequence of words over a telephone, a particular tone of voice, or a designated visual cue would instantly suppress Candy's consciousness and bring Arlene to the surface. When the mission was complete, another trigger would send Arlene back into the dark, and Candy would awaken. The true horror of this mechanism was the absolute amnesia. When Candy regained consciousness in Jensen's office, she had zero recollection of Arlene, the hypnosis, or the horrific conditioning she had just endured. Jensen would offer her a glass of water, gently check her pulse, and assure her that she had simply fallen into a deep restorative sleep. He would gaslight her with a reassuring medical smile. Candy would leave the clinic feeling groggy, but deeply grateful to the doctor who was curing her insomnia. She would walk out onto the bustling streets of New York or Los Angeles, climb into a taxi, and return to her modeling agency. She would review contracts, negotiate with advertisers, and kiss her children goodnight. She functioned perfectly in the high society of the 1960s, completely and utterly oblivious to the fact that she was now a shared vessel. She was carrying a dormant, highly trained sleeper agent inside her own nervous system. The CIA had successfully executed the ultimate theft. They had not stolen her money or her business. They had quietly confiscated her mind. They had transformed an American icon into a human filing cabinet, and they held the only key. The laboratory phase was complete. The weapon was fully armed. It was now time for the intelligence community to test their new invisible courier in the field. The glamorous international life of Candy Jones was about to become the perfect cover for a descent into the geopolitical underworld. The transition from a laboratory subject to an active field operative is the most critical phase of any intelligence operation. For the architects of MKULTRA, Dr. Gilbert Jensen's clinical success in creating the Arlene personality was only a theoretical victory until it was tested in the volatile theaters of the Cold War. The Central Intelligence Agency did not spend millions of dollars merely to play psychological games in a Californian medical office. They required a return on their investment. They needed their biological hard drive to cross enemy lines. By the early 1960s, Candy Jones was unknowingly deployed into active service. The mechanics of her deployment represent the absolute zenith of systemic bureaucratic cruelty. The CIA exploited the legitimate infrastructure of her modeling empire to facilitate their clandestine logistics. Candy had genuine, highly publicized reasons to travel to the geopolitical flashpoints of the era. If she booked a flight to Taipei, Manila, or Tokyo, the public and the press assumed she was scouting exotic locations for fashion shoots or establishing international finishing schools. She traveled with an entourage, designer luggage, and the blinding halo of American celebrity. This was the perfect operational camouflage. When Candy Jones walked through customs in a foreign capital, border guards did not search her custom-made Louis Vuitton trunks for false bottoms or microfilm. They asked for her autograph. She bypassed the intense scrutiny directed at diplomats, military personnel, and known intelligence agents. But the woman boarding the Pan Am flights in New York was often not the woman who disembarked in Asia. The activation protocol was terrifyingly simple. It usually occurred in the isolation of a hotel room or via a secure telephone line. Candy would receive a call. A designated handler, often Dr. Jensen himself, would speak a specific pre-programmed sequence of words. It might have been a mundane phrase about the weather, delivered in a precise metronomic cadence. The auditory trigger acted as a psychological tripwire. Within seconds, the articulate, anxious persona of Candy Jones would shut down, plunging into artificial darkness. In her place, Arlene opened her eyes. Arlene did not care about fashion contracts or the welfare of Candy's children. Arlene was a cold, highly efficient machine engineered for a singular purpose: the delivery of classified assets. Under the control of the Arlene personality, the host body would abandon the luxury hotel suite. She would don a dark wig, alter her makeup, change her posture, and navigate the back alleys of foreign cities. Historical records, later corroborated by hypnotic regression tapes, detail the astonishing nature of these missions. Arlene was not a spy in the traditional sense. She was a high-value mule. She memorized complex alphanumeric codes that she could not consciously decipher. She carried envelopes of untraceable cash to fund anti-communist insurgencies. She transported microdots hidden in the lining of her cosmetics cases. There are even accounts suggesting she was tasked with carrying explosives and experimental toxins to CIA safe houses in South Vietnam and Taiwan. The brilliance of this operational design lay in its absolute unbreakable security. If the courier was compromised, if she was intercepted by the KGB, the Viet Cong, or hostile counterintelligence, the CIA, had a foolproof failsafe. If subjected to physical torture or aggressive interrogation, the extreme stress would likely trigger the collapse of the Arlene personality, bringing Candy Jones back to the surface. And Candy Jones knew absolutely nothing. You cannot extract a state secret from a mind that does not possess it. The enemy interrogators could use sodium pentothal, beatings, or psychological terror, but they would only find a terrified, confused American fashion model who genuinely believed she was in the country to organize a runway show. She would pass every polygraph test because she would be telling the absolute truth as she knew it. The CIA had successfully engineered a human being who could defeat the ultimate lie detector. While the intelligence community celebrated the flawless execution of their courier system, the physical host was rapidly deteriorating. The human brain is not a computer hard drive. It cannot be partitioned without severe biological consequences. The traumatic compartmentalization began to bleed. For Candy, the 1960s became a waking nightmare, defined by the sheer visceral terror of missing time. She would sit down at her vanity mirror in a New York apartment on a Tuesday evening, only to wake up standing on a rain-slicked street in Manila, realizing it was suddenly Friday. The discontinuity of her existence was absolute. The amnesia installed by Dr. Jensen was designed to protect the agency, but it left Candy trapped in a reality filled with terrifying, unexplainable gaps. The physical toll was immediate and brutal. Arlene was subjected to extreme physical stress, hostile environments, and potentially violent encounters during her drops. But it was Candy who had to endure the aftermath. Candy would regain consciousness in luxury hotel rooms to find her body covered in inexplicable bruises, deep scratches, and localized burns. She would find her feet blistered and bleeding, despite having no memory of walking anywhere but carpeted runways. She would open her luggage to find strange utilitarian clothing she had never purchased, or worse, garments stained with blood. The psychological dissonance pushed her to the absolute brink of insanity. She found multiple passports hidden in her belongings, bearing different names, but featuring her photograph. She discovered foreign currencies from countries she had no conscious memory of visiting. When she tried to access her own memories of a weekend trip, she encountered a blank, impenetrable wall of static. Imagine the profound, isolating horror of that existence. Candy could not go to the police. If she walked into a precinct and claimed that she was mysteriously teleporting across the globe and waking up with bruised ribs, she would be institutionalized. Her modeling empire relied entirely on her public image of polished perfection. If the corporate brand she represented caught wind of her erratic behavior and unexplained absences, her business would collapse. She was trapped in a prison with no physical walls, entirely isolated by her own fame. Desperate for answers, Candy naturally turned to the one person she trusted to manage her health, Dr. Gilbert Jensen. This is where the systemic cruelty of the MKULTRA program reached its most sadistic peak. When Candy sat in Jensen's office, weeping, terrified that she was developing early-onset schizophrenia or a brain tumor, Jensen did not offer her the truth. He gaslit her. With a calm, authoritative medical demeanor, he assured her that these memory lapses were simply the result of severe executive stress, hormonal imbalances, and overwork. He convinced her that the bruises were from clumsy accidents she had simply forgotten in her exhaustion. He used her fear of insanity as a weapon to bind her closer to him. He told her she needed more treatment. He prescribed more vitamins. And then he would strap her back into the chair, inject the intravenous narcotics, and reinforce the programming. The system actively protected itself by convincing the victim that she was the one who was broken. The CIA was strip mining her nervous system. By the late 1960s, Candy Jones was a hollowed-out shell of her former self. Her modeling agency was hemorrhaging money because she was increasingly unreliable, missing crucial meetings while her body was hijacked for clandestine errands. Her relationships were strained to the breaking point. She was a woman drowning in a sea of missing days, kept alive only because the machine had not yet finished using her. But a biological machine cannot run indefinitely on experimental narcotics and trauma. The compartmentalized walls in Candy's mind were beginning to crack under the immense pressure. The carefully constructed silence of the MKULTRA project was about to be breached, not by a hostile intelligence agency, but by a late-night radio host who accidentally stumbled upon the most heavily guarded secret of the Cold War. The architects of the MKULTRA program were brilliant scientists, but they possessed a fatal, arrogant blind spot. They engineered a psychological vault that was impenetrable to enemy interrogators, lie detectors, and physical torture. They successfully built a human machine that could operate flawlessly in the freezing altitudes of Cold War geopolitics. But the Central Intelligence Agency fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of human intimacy. They believed they could isolate Candy Jones forever. They did not calculate what would happen if a highly observant man fell in love with her and shared her bed. By the early 1970s, Candy Jones was a discarded asset. The intelligence community does not offer severance packages to its discarded test subjects. When the specific operational needs of the agency shifted, or when the asset became too psychologically degraded to be reliable, the handler simply stopped calling. The triggers were no longer activated. Dr. Gilbert Jensen quietly faded into the background. Candy was left alone in the wreckage of her own mind. She was in her late 40s. Her highly lucrative modeling agency had suffered severely from her years of erratic behavior, and she was crippled by chronic, unexplainable physical pain. More terrifyingly, she was plagued by severe night terrors and an insomnia so profound it bordered on madness. She was a casualty of a war she did not even know she had fought. Enter Long John Nebel. Nebel was a towering figure in New York broadcasting. He hosted a legendary marathon late-night radio show that broadcast to millions of listeners across the eastern seaboard. Nebel was a skeptic, an investigator, and a man who spent his life listening to people tell strange, unbelievable stories in the dark hours of the morning. He was highly intelligent, fiercely protective, and deeply observant. In 1972, Nebel and Candy, who had known each other casually for decades, reconnected. The romance was rapid and intense. Within a month, they were married. For the CIA, this marriage was a catastrophic security breach waiting to happen. The systemic isolation that MKUltra relied upon was shattered. Nebel was not a casual acquaintance or a business partner who only saw Candy's polished daytime facade. He was her husband. He shared her physical space during the hours when her psychological defenses were at their lowest. Almost immediately, Nebel realized that the woman he married was harboring a terrifying secret. Candy's sleep was not a state of rest. It was a theater of trauma. Nebel watched in horror as his new wife thrashed violently in the sheets, speaking in different registers, cowering from invisible abusers, and weeping uncontrollably. She exhibited the classic, undeniable symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress disorder, yet she had no conscious memory of any trauma that could justify such a violent physical reaction. Nebel, desperate to help his wife and exhausted by the sleepless nights, proposed a solution. He had previously studied and practiced amateur hypnosis. He suggested using mild hypnotic induction simply to relax her, to bypass the anxiety keeping her awake, and to grant her a few hours of peaceful sleep. It was a supreme tragic irony. The exact weapon the Central Intelligence Agency had used to destroy her mind was about to become the tool that unlocked her prison. One night in their New York apartment, Nabel began a standard relaxation induction. He spoke softly, guiding Candy into a deep trance. He expected her to drift into a quiet sleep. Instead, he tripped the wire. He accidentally accessed the compartmentalized architecture installed by Dr. Jensen a decade earlier. The physical transformation was instantaneous and blood-chilling. Nabel watched the facial muscles of his wife harden into a mask of cold contempt. The posture shifted. When he asked her a question, the warm, familiar voice of Candy Jones was gone. It was replaced by a harsh, flat, and chillingly pragmatic tone. "Who am I speaking to?" Nabel asked. "I am Arlene," the voice replied. In that single, terrifying moment, the MKULTRA firewall collapsed. Nabel was no longer speaking to his wife. He was face to face with a synthetic sociopath engineered by the United States government. What followed over the next several months is one of the most harrowing documentation processes in the history of psychological abuse. Nabel did not panic. Operating with the cold, methodical precision of a seasoned broadcaster, he brought recording equipment into their bedroom. Night after night, he placed Candy under hypnosis, triggered the Arlene personality, and hit record. He captured hundreds of hours of audio tape. These tapes are the bloody, undeniable receipts of the CIA's crimes. Through the tapes, the horrifying scope of the operation was laid bare. Arlene spoke about Candy Jones in the third person, referring to her with absolute disgust. "She is weak," Arlene stated on the recordings. Arlene detailed the specifics of the programming. She named Dr. Gilbert Jensen. She described the sterile medical offices, the intravenous injections, and the brutal electric shocks used to enforce compliance. She clinically recounted the international flights, the forged passports, and the classified drops in Taiwan and South America. Nabel acted as a hostile interrogator, carefully cross-examining this parasitic identity. He had to navigate the mind of a highly trained intelligence operative trapped inside the body of the woman he loved. It was a psychological hostage negotiation. Nabel discovered that Arlene was programmed to self-destruct if the core programming was threatened. The CIA had installed suicide triggers. If Candy ever came close to uncovering the truth consciously, Arlene was instructed to kill the host body. The sheer sadism of this systemic design is difficult to overstate. The intelligence community had fundamentally corrupted the basic human instinct for survival. They turned Candy's own mind into a loaded gun pointed directly at her own head. When Nabel finally played the tapes back for Candy, while she was fully conscious, the devastation was absolute. Imagine sitting in your living room and listening to your own vocal cords describe acts of espionage, courier drops, and brutal torture that you have absolutely no memory of committing. Imagine hearing a cold, unfamiliar voice emanating from your own throat, plotting against you. For Candy, it was the ultimate violation. The physical abuse she suffered at the hands of the agency was horrific, but the theft of her reality was a terminal blow to her soul. She realized that her entire adult life, her success, her agency, her international travels was nothing but a meticulously constructed theatrical set built to hide a geopolitical machine. She was not a celebrity. She was a puppet. And the strings were buried so deep in her cerebral cortex she could not pull them out without bleeding to death. But the truth was out. The tapes existed. Long John Nabel and Candy Jones now held undeniable audio proof of the CIA's most illegal, immoral domestic operation. The machine had been exposed. The question was no longer what the government had done to Candy Jones. The question was whether an aging fashion model and a late-night radio host could take on the entire American intelligence apparatus and survive the fallout. The decision to expose a clandestine government operation is never simply a matter of telling the truth. It is a calculation of survival. For Candy Jones and Long John Nebel, the sheer volume of the hypnotic tapes they had recorded in their New York apartment presented a terrifying dilemma. They possessed hundreds of hours of audio detailing the inner workings of MKUltra, naming specific doctors, detailing covert drops in foreign capitals, and mapping the psychological architecture of the Arlene persona. They held the smoking gun, but the entity holding the weapon was the Central Intelligence Agency, and the CIA during the 1970s was an apparatus accustomed to burying its mistakes. Nebel understood the immediate physical danger. If he simply went on his radio show and played the tapes without a protective strategy, he and Candy could easily be discredited, institutionalized, or worse, quietly eliminated. The intelligence community excels at framing legitimate whistleblowers as paranoid schizophrenics. Therefore, Nebel chose a strategy of controlled, documented exposure. He sought the expertise of independent medical professionals. He brought in prominent psychiatrists and experts in hypnosis to examine Candy and review the tapes. He needed the medical establishment to confirm that Candy was not fabricating the Arlene identity for attention or financial gain. The independent evaluations were chilling in their consensus. The doctors confirmed that Candy Jones was exhibiting the classic undeniable symptoms of artificially induced multiple personality disorder, now known as dissociative identity disorder, directly linked to severe, systematic, and sustained trauma. The psychological profile perfectly matched the methodologies known to be used in advanced behavioral engineering. Armed with this medical corroboration, Nebel made the calculated decision to publish. He collaborated with writer Donald Bain to author the book The Control of Candy Jones, released in 1976. The publication of the book was a cultural detonation. The American public was already reeling from the Watergate scandal and a growing, pervasive distrust of the federal government. The story of a beloved American supermodel being hijacked by the CIA and turned into a program courier was almost too horrific to believe. It sounded like the plot of a pulp espionage novel, yet the audio transcripts and the independent medical testimony provided a terrifying foundation of truth. The response from the intelligence community was exactly what one would expect from a systemic bureaucracy protecting its deepest secrets: absolute stony silence, followed by aggressive, back-channel discreditation. The CIA never officially confirmed or denied the specific details of Candy Jones's involvement. However, the timing of the book's release was historically significant. It coincided with the Church Committee hearings, a United States Senate Select Committee that was actively investigating illegal intelligence operations. In 1975, the Church Committee officially exposed the existence of MKUltra to the public. They confirmed that the CIA had for decades engaged in illegal mind control experiments using unwitting American citizens, employing LSD, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and hypnosis. The government itself validated the very mechanisms that Arlene described on the tapes. Yet the definitive, unassailable proof was deliberately destroyed. In 1973, anticipating the coming investigations, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKULTRA files. The deliberate erasure of the primary documentation was a masterstroke of historical sabotage. By burning the files, Helms ensured that the full scope of the atrocities would never be known, and he guaranteed that victims like Candy Jones would remain suspended in a permanent state of contested history. Without the official files, skeptics and defenders of the intelligence establishment attacked Candy's story. They suggested that the memories uncovered by Nebel were the result of false memory syndrome. They argued that Nebel, a showman with a flair for the dramatic, might have inadvertently led Candy during the hypnotic sessions, shaping her narrative to fit a sensational story. But this skeptical argument ignores the profound physical toll that the ordeal extracted from Candy. It ignores the unexplained passports, the missing days, the physical injuries sustained during her travels, and the sheer agonizing reality of a woman whose life was functionally destroyed. The final years of Candy Jones's life were not defined by a dramatic courtroom victory or a public apology from the men in the shadows. The system does not apologize to the human inventory it breaks. She lived out the rest of her days dealing with the profound psychological scarring of her experiences. The Arlene personality was eventually suppressed, but the trauma of knowing that she had been a captive passenger in her own body never truly faded. She passed away in 1990, a survivor of a war that the government refused to admit had even taken place. Candy Jones passed away in 1990. The Arlene personality had been suppressed, but the trauma of knowing she had been a captive passenger in her own body never faded. She died a casualty of a covert war the American government erased from its own history, leaving behind nothing but audio tapes and a permanently fractured soul.